The year was 1886, and the autumn sunlight in the Wyoming Territory had already grown thin and sharp, carrying a premonition of the cold that was to come. It was a light that stripped the color from the prairie grass, leaving it a uniform, brittle tan, and it threw long, skeletal shadows from the cottonwoods lining the creek. For Elias Thorne, this light was a clock, each shortened day a tick closer to a deadline he could feel in his bones. He stood, hands on his hips, breathing in the crisp air that tasted of dust and distant pine, and surveyed his work. It was not a cabin he was building, nor a sod house, nor any shelter the other homesteaders in the valley would have recognized. Half buried in the south-facing slope of a low hill behind his small, existing cabin was the immense, rust-streaked form of a cylindrical iron boiler tank, the kind once used to power a great locomotive or a mine pump, now discarded and hauled here at tremendous effort. It was his ark against the coming winter, and to every soul who had passed on the rutted track below, it was the undeniable proof that Elias Thorne's grief had finally broken his mind. He was a widower of 2 years, a fact that defined him in the eyes of the sparse community more than his skill with horses or his quiet, steady nature ever had. Eleanor's passing had left him hollowed out, but it was a clean, quiet grief, a space she had once occupied that he now kept for her memory. The others saw only the absence, and they filled it with their own assumptions. They saw a man alone, talking to himself as he worked, and they called it madness. They saw him digging not foundations for a new home, but a grave for a metal monster, and they called it folly. They could not comprehend the sheer, back-breaking labor he had expended. He had spent the better part of the summer excavating the hillside with nothing but a pick, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow. The clay was dense and studded with rock, and each shovelful felt like lifting a piece of the planet itself. Then came the Herculean task of moving the tank, which he had bought for a pittance from a defunct mining operation 20 miles east. He'd used a team of borrowed oxen, a system of log rollers, stout ropes, and a vocabulary of patient commands learned over a lifetime of working with animals. It took him 3 weeks to drag it, inch by agonizing inch, into the earthen cavity he had prepared. Now it rested there, a dark iron leviathan half swallowed by the prairie. Hiram Poole had been the first to stop and state his opinion plainly. Hiram was a practical man, a rancher whose success was built on proven methods and a deep distrust of novelty. He reined in his horse at the edge of Elias's property, his face a mask of frank disbelief. He watched Elias use a long-handled spade to pack earth and sod against the iron flank of the tank. "Thorne," he had called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "What in God's name is that?" Elias had paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. "It's a house," he replied, his voice even. "A winter house." Hiram had actually laughed, a short, sharp bark that startled his horse. "A house? Elias, that's an iron coffin. Iron draws the cold. You'll be a block of ice come first snowfall. It'll suck the very heat from your bones." He leaned forward in his saddle, his expression shifting from amusement to a kind of condescending pity. "If you need help putting up a proper soddy, you only have to ask. The neighbors would lend a hand. No need for this." Elias had tried to explain. He had learned long ago that explaining a principle was a far more difficult task than demonstrating an outcome, but he felt he owed the man the courtesy of an attempt. "It's not the iron that matters, Hiram. It's the earth around it," he said, gesturing with the spade. "Below the frost line, the ground holds a steady temperature. It doesn't freeze. This tank won't be touching the cold air. It'll be touching the earth. The earth will insulate it." Hiram had simply shaken his head, the concept failing to find any purchase in a mind accustomed to the simple, observable truths of timber, sod, and stone. The earth freezes, Elias. The ground gets as hard as this tank. You've lost your senses. He turned his horse, his parting words a verdict delivered on behalf of the entire valley. We'll be sure to check on you after the first blizzard. A man shouldn't be left to freeze alone, no matter his choices. The encounter set the tone for all that followed. The story of Mad Elias and his iron tomb became a piece of local folklore before it was even finished. A cautionary tale told over dinner tables and around pot-bellied stoves. The women, like Dora Kelleher, whispered it with a sad shake of their heads, mourning the good man Eleanor had left behind. The men treated it as a grim sort of joke. Amusement was a safer position than pity. Elias did not begrudge them their skepticism. It was born of experience, and their experience was limited to what they had seen and what their fathers had taught them. They knew the bite of an iron pump handle on a January morning, the way a cast-iron stove radiated a killing cold when its fire died. Their knowledge was practical, but it was incomplete. They understood outcomes, not principles. Elias's knowledge came from a different source, from a man who had spent his life wrestling with the very heart of heat and cold. His father had not been a farmer or a rancher, but a naval engineer in the shipyards of Baltimore, a man who designed and built the steam engines that powered the great iron ships. As a boy, Elias had spent countless hours in the cacophony of the yards, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. He remembered his father, a man with calloused hands and a mind full of elegant equations explaining the soul of a boiler. "Look here, son," his father had said one afternoon, placing a hand on the massive, riveted side of a cold boiler awaiting installation. The iron was cool, but it was the neutral cool of a cellar, not the biting cold of the winter air outside the workshop. "This vessel is designed to contain immense heat and pressure. To do that, it must be insulated. We pack it with asbestos and wood lagging, but the principle is the same for keeping heat in as it is for keeping cold out. It's not about the iron, it's about what you put between the iron and the world." He had tapped the thick metal plate. "This iron, by itself, is a highway for heat. It moves right through it. But bury that highway in a mountain of something that heat can't travel through, and the highway goes nowhere." That memory was the seed of his current project. He had coupled it with his own observations of the prairie. He had watched badgers and prairie dogs disappear into the earth, and he knew that their deep burrows remained temperate, safe from the killing extremes of both the summer sun and the winter wind. They did not fight the elements. They used the earth itself as a shield. He was simply doing the same, on a human scale, with the materials at hand. His neighbors saw an iron tank. Elias saw a pressure vessel, perfectly engineered to resist the crushing weight of the tons of earth he was piling upon it. They saw a conductor of cold. He saw a stable core, a membrane that he would isolate from the lethal air and connect to the deep, abiding warmth of the earth. The principle was sound. It was a law of thermodynamics, as immutable as gravity. Heat moves from a warmer body to a colder one, always seeking equilibrium. In the Wyoming winter, a wooden cabin was a warm body in an ocean of extreme cold. It constantly bled its precious heat into the air, a battle that could only be won with a ceaseless supply of fuel. His buried cylinder, however, would be a different equation. The vast mass of the earth around it, at a constant 45 or 50 degrees, would be the warm body. The inside of the tank would be the cold body. Heat would flow from the earth, through the iron, and into his living space. The flow would be slow, infinitesimal, but constant. It would not make the chamber warm, not in the way a stove did, but it would bring it to an equilibrium, a stable temperature far above what the air outside would be. It would be the difference between life and death. He had tried to explain this subtlety to Ruth Hartley, a young woman who had come by with a loaf of bread and a quiet curiosity that lacked the mocking edge of the others. She had watched him for a while, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But won't it be damp, Elias?" she asked, her voice soft. "The ground holds moisture." He had nodded, appreciating the practicality of her question. "It will be, at first," he admitted. "But I've dug a French drain around the base to draw water away, and the key is a vapor barrier. I'm lining the floor and lower walls with thick canvas coated in pine tar, the same way they'd waterproof a ship's hull." He showed her the buckets of thick black tar and the rolls of canvas. She had touched the stiff material, her expression thoughtful. "My grandfather was a whaler," she said. "They lived in the hull of a ship for years at a time." She did not laugh or offer pity. She simply looked from the tank to Elias, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She did not grasp the physics, perhaps, but she understood the analogy of a hull against the sea. In this place, the winter was an equally unforgiving ocean. The physical work was the hardest he had ever known. After positioning the tank, he began the monumental task of burying it. He did not just dump dirt against it. He worked with the precision his father had used when lagging a boiler. He cut sod bricks from the prairie, dense squares of earth held together by a thick web of grass roots, and laid them carefully against the iron, grass side down. He packed them tight, leaving no air gaps. Air was the enemy. Air would carry the cold. He worked from the bottom up, creating a thick, solid wall of sod. Then, he backfilled with the loose earth he had excavated, tamping it down every few inches with the end of a heavy log until it was as dense as stone. Day after day, the iron cylinder slowly vanished, disappearing under a man-made hill that merged seamlessly with the natural slope. It was a process of deliberate erasure. He was removing the tank from the world of the air and wedding it to the world of the deep earth. He focused on the small, critical details that would make the difference between a shelter and a tomb. At the front, which faced east to catch the morning sun and stay sheltered from the prevailing northwesterly winds, he had left the circular opening of the boiler exposed. Here, he built a small, heavily insulated wooden anteroom, a sort of airlock. It had an outer door and then an inner door leading into the tank itself. This would prevent the precious, stable air inside from rushing out every time he entered or exited. At the far end of the 12-foot-long cylinder, he had painstakingly drilled a hole through the half-inch thick iron plate, a task that took 2 days and all his drill bits to create a flue for a small stove. The stove itself was a tiny cast-iron box, barely big enough to hold a few chunks of wood or a handful of dried dung. It was not for heating the entire space. That was the Earth's job. The stove was for cooking, for melting snow for water, and for providing a small, localized pool of warmth when the cold became truly psychological. He packed the area where the stovepipe exited the earthen roof with clay and rock, ensuring it was both stable and fireproof. Inside, the space was cramped, a curved iron tunnel about 6 feet in diameter. He built a low wooden platform on one side to serve as his bed, raising it a few inches off the tarred canvas floor. On the other side, he built shelves for his meager supplies: sacks of flour and beans, smoked bacon, coffee, and tins of salt. He hung hooks from the ceiling for his coat and lanterns. It was a space dictated by pure function, with no room for sentiment. Yet, as he worked, he found a strange comfort in the enclosed, womb-like space. The acoustics were peculiar. A dropped hammer echoed with a metallic clang that seemed to hang in the air, but the sounds from the outside world were muted, distant. The world became a rumor. His reality was the cool, curved iron and the smell of earth and pine tar. He stocked his fuel for the small stove with care, not cords of wood like his neighbors, but a small, dense pile of dried cottonwood, supplemented by meticulously collected and dried buffalo chips. His survival was predicated on efficiency, not volume. By mid-October, the work was done. The hillside showed only a gentle, man-made swell, with a single stout wooden door set into its face and a thin metal chimney poking out of the top. From a distance, it looked like an oversized badger set. His small, drafty cabin, the one he had shared with Eleanor, stood nearby, looking forlorn and temporary. He moved his essential supplies into the cylinder, leaving the cabin to the mice and the wind. He spent the last few weeks of autumn in his new home, acclimating to the strange quiet and the perpetual twilight within. The air was cool and held the damp, clean scent of a cave. He kept a thermometer hanging from a hook, and he watched it with scientific detachment. As the nights grew colder, the temperature outside would drop to freezing and below, but inside the tank, the needle barely wavered, holding steady at a cool but consistent 52 degrees. This was before he had even lit a fire. It was the earth breathing its slow, ancient warmth into the iron. The first snow came at the beginning of November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But the old-timers, the few remaining trappers who knew the land's rhythms, saw the signs. The beavers were building their lodges higher and reinforcing them with extra mud. The elk had come down from the high country weeks earlier than usual. A deep cold was coming, they said, a winter that would be remembered. Elias listened and continued his preparations, ensuring his door seals were tight and his flue damper worked perfectly. He felt a quiet, calm readiness. He had not built his shelter based on folklore or guesswork, but on a principle as solid as the iron that surrounded him. He had faith in his father's knowledge and in his own observations. Now, all that was left was the test. The test arrived on the third week of November. It did not come gently. The sky turned the color of lead, and the wind began to moan from the north, a low, keening sound that slowly rose in pitch until it was a physical scream. The temperature, which had been hovering in the 20s, plummeted. Elias watched the world disappear through the small, thick glass porthole he'd installed in his door. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding white torrent that erased the landscape. He checked the thermometer outside his door one last time. It read 10 degrees below zero, and the storm was only just beginning. He retreated inside, closing the inner door and dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. The shrieking of the wind instantly subsided, replaced by a profound, muffled silence. The storm was no longer a sound. It was a low vibration he could feel through the soles of his boots, the rage of the world transmitted through tons of earth. He lit a single lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the deep shadows and glinting off the curved walls. The air inside was still and cold, the thermometer reading a steady 50 degrees. His breath plumed in the lantern light. This was the crucible. For the next few days, the outside world would cease to exist. He was a passenger inside his vessel, trusting it to carry him through the tempest. He felt a strange sense of peace, a detachment from the life or death struggle that he knew was unfolding in every other cabin in the valley. There, families would be huddled around roaring stoves, feeding them constantly, plugging drafty windows with rags, and listening to the wind tear at their roofs. Their survival was an active, frantic battle. His was passive. He had done his work months ago. Now he simply had to wait. He had to trust the earth. He spent the first day organizing his supplies, reading a worn copy of Shakespeare by lantern light, and sleeping. The silence was absolute. The only sounds were the rustle of his own movements and the quiet hiss of the lantern. He resisted the urge to light the stove. It was not yet necessary. The temperature inside held. He ate his food cold. He wore a heavy wool coat and a hat, but he was not shivering. It was the kind of deep, penetrating cold that came from a cellar, not the aggressive, killing cold that was scouring the world just a few feet above his head. He placed his bare hand against the iron wall. It was cold, yes, but it was a dead cold, a neutral temperature that did not seem to draw the heat from his skin. It felt like touching a stone pulled from a deep well. This was the proof. The iron was not in contact with the sub-zero air. It was in thermal equilibrium with the vast, stable mass of the hill. On the second day, the low vibration of the wind intensified. He could only imagine the fury of the blizzard. He decided to light a small fire in the stove, not for warmth, but to cook a proper meal and boil water. He used just 3 pieces of cottonwood, and the small iron box soon radiated a welcome heat. The temperature in the immediate vicinity of the stove rose to a comfortable 65 degrees, but the overall temperature of the cylinder barely changed. He was not trying to heat the iron or the air. He was just creating a small island of comfort. He cooked a stew of beans and bacon, and the smell filled the small space, a welcome scent of domesticity in his subterranean world. As he ate, he thought of his father. He pictured him in the engine room of a ship, surrounded by hissing pipes and gauges, reading the pressure, feeling the temperature, understanding the invisible forces at play. His father had mastered the art of containing heat. Elias, in his own way, had mastered the art of excluding cold. The principle was the same. It was about insulation, equilibrium, and working with the laws of nature rather than fighting against them. The storm raged for 4 days. For Elias, they passed in a quiet monastic routine. He ate, he slept, he read. He tended his tiny fire with miserly care, using less wood in 4 days than his neighbors would burn in 4 hours. He felt no fear, only a growing sense of quiet vindication. He had taken a piece of industrial refuse, an object whose nature was to transfer heat, and by burying it in the earth, he had transformed it into a perfect insulator. He had built a home that required almost no energy to maintain, a shelter that achieved its comfort not by generating heat, but by holding on to the gentle, inexhaustible warmth of the planet itself. It was a profound and deeply satisfying realization. He had not conquered the winter. He had simply stepped aside and let its fury pass him by. On the morning of the 5th day, he awoke to a different quality of silence. The low, oppressive vibration was gone. He cracked the inner door and was met not with a blast of frigid air, but with still, cold quiet. He opened the outer door and was confronted by a solid wall of white. The snow had drifted up, completely burying his entrance. He was sealed in. For a moment, a flicker of panic touched him, but it passed just as quickly. He had a shovel. He began to dig. The snow was light and powdery, and it took him less than an hour to carve a narrow tunnel upwards into the blinding daylight. When he finally emerged, the world was unrecognizable. The snow was immense, a rolling, sculpted landscape of white that had buried fences and sagebrush, smoothing the sharp contours of the land into soft, sweeping dunes. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so cold and still it felt as though it would crack like glass. The silence was absolute. He stood for a long time, breathing in the crystalline air, letting his eyes adjust to the glare. His small cabin was nearly invisible, only the peak of its roof and the top of its stone chimney showing above the drifts. Further down the valley, he could see the other homesteads, each marked by a plume of dense wood smoke rising vertically into the sky. They had survived. But he knew what that survival had cost them in fuel, in comfort, in fear. He had spent the storm in calm and relative security. He looked back at the hole in the snow from which he had emerged. It was as if he had been born anew from the earth itself. He felt a quiet, solid triumph that needed no audience. He had been right. The principle had held. Later that day, he saw two figures making their way slowly across the snow-crusted valley on snowshoes. It was Hiram Poole and another man, Amos Kelleher. They moved with the grim, determined gait of men on an unpleasant duty. They were carrying shovels. As they drew closer, Elias could see the exhaustion etched on their faces, their beards rimed with frost. They were heading for the gentle swell of the hill where he lived, and he knew instantly what they were thinking. They had come to dig him out, expecting to find his frozen corpse. Elias waited for them, standing by the entrance to his tunnel. Hiram saw him first. He stopped dead, his mouth falling open slightly. He lifted a hand and pointed, a look of utter astonishment on his face. Amos stumbled to a halt beside him. They had clearly prepared themselves for a grim discovery, not for the sight of the man they had pitied, standing calmly in the snow as if he had just stepped out for a breath of fresh air. They trudged the remaining distance, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Elias," Hiram said, his voice hoarse. We thought, with the cold," he gestured vaguely at the buried landscape. The temperature was still well below zero. "We thought you'd frozen in that thing." Elias simply nodded. "It was a considerable storm," he said, his tone understated. "I am well." There was a long, awkward silence. The two men looked from Elias to the hole in the snow, then back to Elias. They were trying to reconcile the scene before them with the laws of nature as they understood them. It was not possible. An iron box under the snow should have been a death trap. "How?" Amos finally asked, his voice a whisper. "How are you not dead?" "Would you care to see?" Elias offered. He led them down his narrow snow tunnel to the outer door. He pushed it open, revealing the small anteroom, and then opened the inner door. A wave of air, not warm but distinctly less hostile than the air outside, washed over them. It smelled of earth and faintly of wood smoke. He invited them in. They had to stoop to enter the curved cylinder, and once inside, they stood blinking in the lantern light, their bulky winter coats making the space feel even more cramped. Hiram ran a gloved hand along the curved iron wall. He pulled his glove off and placed his bare palm against it. His face was a study in profound confusion. He looked at the tiny stove, now cold and dark. He looked at Elias's bed, a neat pile of wool blankets. He looked at the thermometer hanging from its hook. It read 48 degrees. "I don't understand," Hiram said, turning to Elias. "My cabin. We had the stove roaring for 4 days straight. We burned nearly half a cord of wood, and still the water bucket froze solid 2 feet from the fire. The walls were coated in frost. We never stopped shivering. But in here, it's still." He searched for the right word. "It's not warm, but it's not cold either. It just is." Elias allowed himself a small, rare smile. "The earth," he said simply. "You were fighting the air. I was borrowing warmth from the earth." He explained it again, the principle of insulation and geothermal heat. He spoke not with the arrogance of a man proven right, but with the quiet patience of a teacher. He talked about the tons of dirt and sod acting as a blanket, shielding the iron from the unimaginable cold of the air, and how the iron then slowly absorbed the steady, deep warmth of the ground. This time, Hiram Poole listened. He did not interrupt. He did not scoff. He stood in the impossible shelter, feeling the truth of it in the air around him, a truth that defied his lifelong experience but was undeniably real. After a long silence, Hiram looked at Elias, his eyes full of a new and profound respect. "I called it a coffin," he said, his voice low with humility. "I was wrong, Elias. I was a fool." He extended a hand. "You were right." The admission, spoken so plainly, was more satisfying to Elias than any boast could have been. It was the acknowledgement not just of his survival, but of the idea behind it. Amos Kelleher, who had remained silent, simply shook his head in wonder. "I'll be damned," he murmured. "I'll be truly damned." They did not stay long. They had livestock to check on and damage to assess. But as they left, they walked with a different posture. They had arrived on a grim errand of pity and had departed as students of a new philosophy. The story of Elias Thorne's survival spread through the valley. But this time, it was not a tale of madness. It was a legend. The winter of 1886 became known as the Great Cold, a benchmark of hardship against which all other winters were measured. It took a heavy toll on livestock and left many families with frostbite and dwindling supplies. In the midst of this shared suffering, Elias's story stood out as a beacon of ingenuity. People began to visit him, not to mock, but to ask questions. They brought gifts of smoked meat or fresh-baked bread, and in return, Elias shared his knowledge freely. He explained the principles to them, sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing them how to use the earth not as an enemy to be held at bay, but as an ally. He became an unlikely sage, the man in the hill, a quiet innovator whose strangest of ideas had proven to be the sanest of all. In the years that followed, the landscape of the valley began to change in subtle ways. Homesteaders started digging their root cellars deeper, incorporating some of Elias's principles to better protect their winter stores. Several families built small, buried storm shelters, modest versions of his own home, as a refuge against the worst of the blizzards. The thorn cellar, as it came to be known, became a mark of a well-prepared homestead. Elias himself lived out his days in the iron cylinder, finding a deep and abiding peace in its quiet, stable embrace. It was more than a shelter. It was a testament to a way of thinking, a monument to the power of a single, well-understood principle. The boiler, once an artifact of industrial power designed to conquer nature, had been repurposed, through human intellect and labor, into a vessel of harmony with it. Decades later, long after Elias was gone, children would play on the grassy hill, tracing the faint outline of the iron home buried beneath, and they would be told the story of the man who survived the great cold, not by fighting the winter, but by sleeping soundly in the warm, quiet heart of the earth.